Thanks for downloading this episode from Teachers Talk Radio. You can find the full schedule and listen back to all our shows at ttradio.org. Enjoy the podcast.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading. Introducing My New Term, the revolutionary technology application connecting schools and candidates directly. Whether you're a school seeking to streamline your recruitment process or a candidate searching for your next role in education, My New Term has the solution. Developed by a former teacher, the technology at My New Term now connects tens of thousands of candidates with schools every month by digitizing the recruitment process. As a candidate, you can search for jobs, set up recommended jobs, and save time by applying directly to schools via a standardized online process. No more completing manual and repetitive application forms. Employers can streamline processes and save time utilizing the leading applicant tracking system for schools and multi-academy trusts. Recruitment in education has been broken for too long. My New Term is on a mission to change just that. Visit mynewterm.com to learn more, search all the latest opportunities, or schedule a demo. My New Term, shaping the future of education recruitment.
Hi everyone, it's Tom here from Teachers Talk Radio, just dropping by to tell you about our annual history teaching extravaganza, Teachers Talk History, which is coming at you live in Manchester on the 21st of September. The tickets are completely free for classroom teachers, amazing speakers, brilliant contributors, and a fantastic opportunity to network with fellow professionals. Grab your free ticket today at ttradio.org/events, and we will see you there.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Teachers Talk Radio on this Monday evening, the 12th of August. We're going to have a discussion tonight about the recent news and announcements regarding schools to, in inverted commas, wage war on putrid fake news and conspiracy theories. This was an announcement coming from an interview with Bridget Phillipson, the Education Secretary, who did an interview with The Telegraph, where she said, quote, "It's more important than ever that we give young people the knowledge and skills to be able to challenge what they see online. That's why our curriculum review will develop plans to embed critical skills in lessons to arm our children against disinformation, fake news, and conspiracy theories on social media. Our renewed curriculum will always put high and raising standards in core subjects that the non-negotiable, blah-de-blah." And the focus seems to be on this idea of critical thinking, critical thinking skills, to give students these skills that they can then approach information online in a way where they can almost analyze and evaluate its veracity and understand whether it is fake news or not. This has launched a bit of debate online within the education community around the first thing, I guess, that's been debated is what is critical thinking? What are critical skills? But I think the bigger debate is, can you teach critical skills? And it's also played into debates that have been discussed recently in the wider societal sense about freedom of speech and about how you identify what is fake news, what is hate speech, what is, all of these things. That's come under the microscope from people on both sides of the political spectrum. Many on the left are saying we need to do more on this because it's become a bit of a free-for-all. People are being able to say and do whatever they want online in a way that is often aggressive and hateful and racist and misogynistic and so on and so on. There are those maybe further to the right who are saying that freedom of speech is freedom of speech, and any limitations on freedom of expression are a bad thing. Regardless of what is being said, it's almost sort of the attitude of that, that's an open forum. That's free speech. That's what we need to be doing, and that debate is sort of set behind this announcement from Bridget Phillipson around sort of embedding more critical thinking into the curriculum. So that's what we're going to hopefully discuss tonight. And welcome to everybody listening along. Before we kick off the conversation, it's just a chance for me to thank our sponsors, as always on the show, John Catt Educational. If you haven't heard of John Catt, they're publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning. Now, I would highly recommend any John Catt book. They issue a whole range of different books within the education sector. Such a big range of content out there, and you can explore it all at the John Catt Bookshop at johncattbookshop.com, and you can use the code JCTTR2425 to get 20% off the order, and that includes any amount of books that you put into the basket. So I'll refer back to John Catt later on, but hopefully we're going to kick off the conversation imminently. Let me just tell you some of the people who I've got coming into the conversation this evening. I've got Claire Fox, who is the former MEP and currently director at the Academy of Ideas, who is going to join in the conversation. I've got Kirsty B, who is a head of English currently, and a mentor and a lot of other things besides. I've hopefully got Alistair as well. Paul is going to join in, Paul Cochrane as well. And yeah, we're going to have hopefully other people join in too. And of course, you, if you want to get involved in this conversation as well. So Kirsty's the first to call in. So Kirsty, how are you this evening?
Hello, I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Not too bad. Now,
Good.
Kirsty, I've sort of outlined the lines on this. Let me ask you first, can you teach critical thinking?
I wish I could. I think it's one of the most complex skills we strive for all of our students to use, isn't it? I mean, I know for English language anyway, it's one of the highest boundaries to be able for them to criticise what they're reading. I don't think we can explicitly teach it. I think we could possibly model it based on different sources and different examples across subjects, but to explicitly teach such a complex skill, I don't believe we can yet. Anyway.
Yeah. Now, what do you make of the idea? Because in this same article and in the conversation, there's been a lot of sort of like talk about the different subjects and what they can offer in regards to, you know, they've given sort of examples and stuff like that. So, you know, they've given examples in English, and you're ahead of English, of them analysing like newspaper articles, and then being able to look at whether those articles are fake news or not. Now, don't you do that already?
Yeah, well, this is it. I saw in the newspaper clipping that you posted that there was an example given that English could do this, and yes, we already do it. It's GCSE English Language Paper 2, and it's also done quite a lot in A-level English Language 2. But the issue that we have at the minute is that quite a lot of the sources we're given are literary non-fiction. So a lot of the news that Bridget Phillipson wants students to criticise at the minute isn't something that we interact with in lessons, because that's not the kind of sources they're given in the exam. Obviously, we don't teach to the exam, and plenty of schools do a brilliant job with offering loads of different sources, but the kind of sources we get, it's kind of got nothing to do with presenting a certain viewpoint or a certain controversial point of view in terms of the news. It's more about an experience or an autobiography and such. So in terms of the opportunity we've had to do this, especially in regards to things like the riots, it's not really been present recently.
Yeah. Do you think that you should be doing that in light of recent events? I mean, do you think that English teachers should be studying contemporary newspaper articles and online sources more often in lessons?
I absolutely think so. I think there's definitely a room for that. I mean, I know in previous, specifications that has been done far more than it is now. Because that's the first issue that came to my mind, to be honest, with how politically driven it seemed to be. It'd be great to do it, but what sources do we use? So, for example, if I were to approach, say, my Year 10 class, would I give them an article from the Daily Mail or the Guardian, and then what discussions would that follow from that? Because the sources that you give them, it's going to be some kind of politically driven. driven? What kind of conversations is that going to generate with students? If it's something that's a little bit too heated, are teachers trained enough to be able to spot any really bad misinformation? And I just think that what concerned me as well is that if we're going to be really analysing explicitly this kind of fake news, what kind of political viewpoints are we then challenging? Because as we know, some of our students come to school with the viewpoint of their families that's been historical. You know, we standing there going, you know, if you're reading this in the Daily Mail, for example, you and all your family are wrong. And I just think that opens a whole can of worms that I don't know if Bridget Phillipson is aware of. So yes, I do think there's definitely a place for us to do that more. But it's going to be way harder than just going, right, yeah, let's look at this headline, for example.
I mean, I'm going to be asking you lots of questions, Kirsty, over the
That's
next
fine.
probably hour or so. Are you sticking around, by the way, just so I know?
Yeah,
You're going to
yeah,
be
that's
here,
fine,
right?
yeah.
Yeah, I'll be dipping in and out. I've got Alistair and Claire, so I'll bring Claire in next and then go to Alistair. So Claire, good evening. How are you? Hopefully you can unmute bottom left-hand side if you're on your phone. I'll come back to Claire. Alistair, are you there?
Hi, Tom. Can you hear me okay?
Hi, yeah, I can hear you loud and clear. Alistair, I want to ask you sort of what your take on this is and whether you are a fan of what Bridget Phillipson is suggesting.
Yeah, well, thanks for the chance to join in here, Tom. I think it's a really important subject. And the first thing that I would say is that your listeners will tell that I don't have an English accent. I come from Northern Ireland. So the first thing to note is that our context is actually quite different from the context in that you face in England. And Kirsty, you were raising some very interesting points there about the nervousness that teachers can have when approaching political points of view in terms of, you know, how do you encourage discussion without taking a position? How do you encourage debate without imposing your own point of view? And how do you manage all of that? Of course, living in Northern Ireland, we've had a context where this is something that's been going on my entire life. We've lived in a context where there has been not only debate, but violence. Thankfully, for the past 30 years, we've moved beyond that. But I'm involved in a program called Shared Education, which is a program that is involving, I think, around about a third of the schools in Northern Ireland, that seeks to bring together young people from both sides of the two main communities here. There are lots more communities, of course. But what we're doing is bringing our young people together in the context where there's going to be huge difference of opinion. There'll be, you know, Tom, you'll know this as an historian, there'll be one set of historical events, but historical events are always interpreted, and we have at least two main interpretations, if not many more, of those events. So into that context, we're used to dealing with young people that are bringing not only different views, but diametrically opposed views. And Kirsty, as you're talking about, those views are very often reflecting the communities that they're growing up in. So in that context, I think Northern Ireland has some interesting perspectives to share, because we have been on this journey of how do we encourage dialogue whenever there is such fundamental disagreement. So the first thing I would just say is to acknowledge that. I mean, I can share a few of the things that we've learned from that journey. One of the key things is to validate the importance of listening to one another. And absolutely, I don't go into shared education saying there is one correct view of the historical events in Northern Ireland, or even the contemporary events that are viewed through those historical perspectives. What we will do is validate the range of views and allow people to articulate them. But we need to articulate them in a context where there is a contract, so to speak, even if that's an unofficial one, an informal one, where we are in a context where we're prepared to listen to each other, we're prepared to try to understand each other. I think that's one of the key things, to recognize that I can listen to somebody else's point of view that is completely different from me, and where I would disagree entirely, but I can understand where they come from. That doesn't mean that I have to agree with them by any stretch of the imagination, but at least it gives us a basis of trust for those conversations. I'm not saying that it's easy. We've had some major challenges with that. I'm just pointing out that there is this little area in the UK where we've perhaps had a little bit more, because of our history experience in dealing with these issues.
Claire, Claire, I was going to bring you in next and just ask you, what do you think of this from Bridget Phillipson?
I'm very anxious about it, actually. I thought that what Alistair said was entirely sensible, and that, that's an approach to these questions and listening to everyone and so on. But that's not what Bridget Phillipson has advocated. I mean, she's talked about putrid conspiracy theories, ensuring that teachers get rid of extremism. What does she mean by extremism?
But Claire, those things do exist, right? Yeah, I mean, those are putrid conspiracy theories and extremism does exist.
They do. But are you seriously telling me that you think that teachers in a classroom are going to be able to define what they are when there's a huge row over what they are outside of the classroom amongst adults? And so the danger is that you become a little bit like with Prevent. I thought of Prevent because I remember being on a panel once in which somebody very seriously said, well, we've had to implement Prevent provisions. This was in 2016. They said we've had to implement Prevent provisions because a number of our students, quite a lot of our students in the Northeast, have exhibited extremism because they're just following their parents and they seem to be supportive of leaving the EU. I just let that sink in, right? And he thought this was like far right extremism and that Prevent was a necessary ingredient into the conversation. So the danger is that this, of course, becomes politicized in the classroom. It's very difficult. That's why I liked what Alistair was saying. Alistair was saying, there's different perspectives brought by different people with different opinions. Lots of kids will have different views. And what my concern is that Bridget Phillipson is talking about clamping down on mis and disinformation. And then, the softer side is to say, we'll teach critical thinking. I like the way you started off, Tom, by explaining that for me, the best method for ensuring that our pupils have the capacity to think critically is to introduce them to a knowledge-rich curriculum in literature, in history, in all of the subjects. Because if you do that, then, that's how you learn to think, isn't it? That you read lots of novels. I mean, that's just because I'm a former English teacher. I appreciate that. But you know what I mean? You start to understand different perspectives. You have a sense of empathy. The difficulty with saying, let's clamp down and wage war on putrid fake news, to use the headline that you've used for this conversation, is that suggests teachers are going to take on the role of telling pupils what is putrid, what is fake, and it's not as straightforward as that.
Alistair, sorry about a minute ago. I think I was muted. But Alistair, do you have any thoughts on what Claire's saying there? Just what she said there.
Yeah. So really where we come from with this is the fundamental thing of establishing good relationships between the pupils in the classrooms, right? So this becomes less about dealing with ideas in abstract or in theoretical context. It becomes about dealing with the ideas of people that are sitting beside you. And in that context, my role is one where I have to try and be as neutral as possible, because I want to be able to cross-examine those ideas, and I don't want to the pupils to think that I'm coming from one particular point of view. But we're not talking about, at least not in my experience, this in abstract and theory. We're talking about it with the pupils that are in our classes. So if you've got a diverse class, which you will be teaching a diverse class, I mean, we have immigrant young people of who are children of immigrants. We've got Protestants, Catholics, with all sorts of different people in the mix. And what we're trying to do here is to take away the stereotype of the label. And maybe some of the associations that some of the other students would have, that because you are this label, that means you must be this set of characteristics, which of course is not true. Even if we do fit underneath a broad category and we identify with a label, there's so much more to any individual human being. There's so much more to us as a group than just that one label. So I just find that whenever we're in that context where we're getting to know the people that we're in, and we're talking there and we're listening and exploring ideas, it becomes, I think some of the concerns that Claire you're sharing become a little less threatening in that context, because we are talking about those individuals where we're listening to each other and understanding each other as individuals, as people that we know, with relationships rather than just in the abstract.
Claire, I don't know whether you
Tom, want to... Yeah, I wanted to say, look, what I'm saying is I like what Alistair's saying. I'm nervous about how a government minister will be interpreted with these kind of injunctions on teachers to stamp out on fake news. That was where we were kind of coming from, and what it would actually mean in the classroom. If it would mean that we would listen to each other and undo stereotypes, then all to the good. I mean, that's very important. But it's also the case that there is, and all teachers know this, there is just a danger of getting dragged into a political situation. And that's all I'm talking about. What do you do if in your classroom a student says, well, is there a problem with mass migration? And somebody else says, that's fake news, that's a putrid conspiracy theory, or that's extremism. That means you're a racist. Or say, conversely, somebody says, Israel is out to kill everybody in Gaza, and so on and so forth. I'm simply using those far extremes just to say a teacher's job is, first of all, to basically teach a subject, generally speaking, and to do that and negotiate their way through it. Absolutely, for young people to be able to understand that their particular outlook there is narrow, and that they need to open their minds to other ideas and other viewpoints, and understand the world is more complicated than the latest meme or the latest TikTok that they've just watched. But my worry is that when a government starts telling teachers that they need to to almost take the lead in stamping out on what is highly contentious outside the classroom amongst adults, that it will become oversimplified, in a way propagandizing, and in danger of demonizing a particular set of ideas as opposed to another set of ideas, which is a political intervention rather than an intellectual one based on the kind of knowledge that we want to pass on to our students.
Just before I go to Kirsty and Paul,
Tom, sorry, Tom, I don't want to monopolise things, but can I maybe just respond quickly to that, please?
Well, very briefly, because I've got loads of other people on. Go.
Yeah, sure. Geography is the subject I teach. We talk about immigration as one of our topics. So all of those issues, Claire, that you've outlined are things that I've had to grapple with. And some of the ways in which I've tried to do this isn't only about the presentation of different positions, whatever term you would put on them, on the issue of migration. I start this off very much in the context of telling the stories, of understanding what it would be like for people that are in those situations as immigrants, because I think empathy is a really important thing. Whatever position you end up with on this, and I will absolutely acknowledge to my students that there are many legitimate different views on how many people we should be letting into the UK. We're letting people, we're talking about people. So we started by talking about some of those journeys, and I will have, and I'm sure many of the teachers here will have, either immigrant children themselves or children of immigrants in their class. We have got people who can tell those stories, and I really just want to put those stories front and center in order for us to understand again that we are talking about people in this context. And then the views that are expressed about that are expressed in that context where it's less about, again, as I mentioned earlier, this theoretical concept. It's more about talking about the people that are involved. So it's approaching, I suppose, the teaching of this is not just about communicating ideas and theory and concepts about it, but actually teaching in the broader sense of allowing our young people to develop that empathy and understanding that can help inform their positions.
Does that, though, Alistair, and I'm playing completely devil's advocate here, by the way, with this, does bringing in the people's stories inherently present a positive view of it? Because does that make sense? Because it's much less likely that someone would sit there and say, okay, I've come into this from an immigrant background, and I've got a terrible story to tell about my sort of situation today. It's probably much more likely they're going to have a sort of do you know what I mean? Like a positive story.
Yeah, yes, I do. And again, I do need to be careful with this, but it does tell the story of individuals and people so that we can get beyond the stereotypes. Because when you look at the ideas that are being expressed online, a lot of the stuff that's on X at the moment and other social media platforms tends to dehumanize. There was a parade, an Orange Order parade in Derry just over the weekend, 15,000 Protestants going and parading in the city of Derry. That is a controversial thing. There was a comment online that described them as 15,000 sectarian bigots, was how that was described. And that's one entire group that's summarized by two highly pejorative terms. that dehumanizes and puts them all together as one. So I suppose in the context of, the dangerous ideas, I mean, that's how I think I would probably want to push back against that. When somebody says that, what I'm doing is presenting an alternative within this group en masse that we tend just to label. And goodness knows in Northern Ireland, we've had a lot of labels: Protestant, Catholic, nationalist, unionist, whatever it would be. Beyond the label is the human. And certainly the peace building that has gone on here and the reconciliation that we've done has been driven in large part by humanizing the other and recognizing our fellow humanity in people that are very, very different from us.
Thanks, Alistair. Claire, I will give you an opportunity to come back in on that in a few minutes if you'd like. I'm just going to bring Paul in next. Paul, are you there? We'll just check you. Hello.
Hello. Does that work, Tom?
Yeah, it does. Can hear you loud and clear. Yep. Paul, what are your thoughts on just the main thing here of this waging war on fake news and conspiracy theories?
Well, I mean, my take on it from the start was apparently they were talking about teaching critical thinking skills. And I looked up a definition, and it's quite good fun because, within the first page of Google, my old friend, I had what are the 4 essential C's of critical thinking? Another one, what are the 5 components? What are the 6 simple rules? What are the 7 steps that are essential? So there's no individual definition.
No.
And so what I tend to do is I tend to go to the Learning Scientists, which is a bunch of, is that the correct collective noun for psychiatrists and psychologists? And they actually try to take psychological research and put it into the educational context. And a lovely lady called Althea Kaminsky, talks about, your first premise was, can we actually teach this? And she says, well, yes, you can, but through domain knowledge and through learners gradually getting more and more experience and more background knowledge and their ability to interrelate that to other subjects and start to think beyond that. But she also said that if you try to, positively and proactively teach it, you get the same sort of standard deviation curve you get for other teaching activities, which is it gets taught well and it gets taught poorly, and some learners learn it well and some learners learn it poorly. I mean,
but she does stress though in that article how difficult it is to teach.
Yes, absolutely.
I mean, sort of once you've read through it all, you're going, this for a even for an expert teacher, this is going to be incredibly challenging.
Yeah, and I think what Alistair and Claire were saying, I think the contributors so far have been really, really good.
Don't blow their trumpets too much, Paul. Come on. I'm
just hoping for some reflected glory later on. But what was interesting is that I think we live now in a very binary world, and I think politics is very binary as well. And there's no nuance anymore. You're either with us or against us.
I agree with that.
And I've got there's some examples recently where, from my own personal bias, where Rishi Sunak said that the real dangers to the United Kingdom were Russia, Iran, North Korea, China, and Scottish nationalists, talking about a democratic party who have always went through civic and peaceful means and not always got it right. Sir Keir Starmer says that we're now the true party of English patriotism, and you think, well, there's a lot going on there, because you're doing that othering thing, which even the political party I support does as well, which is you've really got to choose us because the rest are going to be dangerous. And I think there's no nuance there, which is really worrying. But
hasn't that always happened to an extent?
Yes, but I think then when one of those little factions, a very big faction, one of those little political groups decides that they're going to tackle it and wage war on putrid fake news and conspiracy theories, I think it's very dangerous. I'm a big believer in social justice, but I'm very wary of it being dictated, which it is in our standards in Scotland, because it's like, well, who's social justice? Because it won't always be the political party you like. And if you could imagine somebody like Trump or a Trump being in charge in Britain, their idea of what's fake news and conspiracy theories is totally different from mine. But if they've already got that framework, that aim of education that we're going to teach critical thinking skills, but on my terms, I'm very worried about trying to embed that just now. I do think you should do it through good teaching, good learning, good experiences. And sometimes you've just got to step back from the kids a wee bit and let them work out their own values sometimes. It's very difficult to do. In fact, if I wanted to destroy my political aims in life, the worst thing I could do is probably try and teach them, because what kids are like, or so you're one of them, right? I'm going to go on the opposite side. But I just think it's a very nuanced area, And I'm kind of worried when politicians who are not very nuanced creatures, start putting the boot in, the tackety boots on, and start kicking away and punching and saying, I'm going to sort this out. Thank you, Tom.
I'll go to Kirsty, then to Claire, and then I've got a little chat, hopefully, with Dan, who's just joined us. So, Kirsty, do you want to say anything on what Paul's just said?
Yeah, I mean, there's what I've been really enjoying then, to be honest, was the mention of the humanistic approach from Alistair, that realistically, a teacher in a classroom, at the end of the day, when we're not teaching A-level politics, we are trying to get them to get to their GCSEs, to get them to the next step. And as an English teacher, we're always trying to teach them about intention and purpose. And I think it would be really useful, and I think all teachers could do this if we're talking about quick wins, is to help students to identify the gap between the writer and a reader. So obviously social media creates a huge distance between whatever's created, be that a article, it could be a TikTok video, it could be a comment on a YouTube video. It's all discourse that we want students to be able to go, I should probably double check whether this is true or not. And that's so hard to get them to see the difference between what is real and what isn't. So I think getting students to understand that these pieces of writing or these pieces of news are deliberately made for a certain audience with a certain agenda would perhaps help quite a lot. But again, that's such a huge layer to teach. And as I'm listening to everyone, I'm just thinking that it's so nuanced. It's to do with how they are nurtured at home. It's to do with external influences, having a great understanding of many different domains, being aware of different societal issues, having good morals and values. It's all this kind of stuff that allows them to be great critical thinkers. And it's a huge, huge job that I think, we would love to be magicians to be able to make every single student critical thinkers. But Bridget Phillipson really needs to maybe, speak to quite a few teachers before revamping the curriculum, to use her words.
I mean, on a very simple level, if you were to really simplify this and break it down, you could argue, I know I'll bring Claire in a second, but Claire was saying earlier about, sort of identifying what's fake news and identifying, asking students to do that. I see it less about that and more about, okay, you see something online, let's go through a process, a thinking process, an actual practical process. And actually for a year 7, you could break that down into a very, very 2 or 3 step a very simple formula of check the source, wait for a little bit, check 10 other sources to see if it matches up in terms of that. And, then wait for a bit and check this and do this. And you can have a simple process there to sort of fact check, if you like. And, Claire, I'll put it to you that, one of the most infamous examples, I guess, in the last few weeks of this is where, after the terrible events of Southport, Nigel Farage shared the wrong name of the person who had done it, so to speak, very quickly, and other people did too. So that would surely be a very good example of where this is worth doing and worth teaching, trying to teach the students how to process it, not what is fake news or isn't, but the process of actually going, let's not make a mistake here.
Well, it's true that mistakes were made, but they were made on all sides. And one of the political...
Yeah, no, but I'm just picking out that as a specific example.
No, I know, but that is the example that lots of people are using that example. I'm only saying it because I think this is where the difficulty is for classroom teachers, because, similarly, Nick Lowles from Hope Not Hate said that there was acid, people going around throwing acid in the faces of Muslims, and that terrified so many people. They really thought that was happening, and it wasn't true, but he hasn't been in the spotlight. Now, as for checking, a couple of things to say. One thing is that I don't know about you, but every time I've fallen for, some AI generated false image or some false story, it's often been teenagers who put me right, because they're often more savvy than we anticipate, just to draw attention to that. The other thing is that I think a lot of the stereotyping that's gone on, because we have to remember the context of this is post these riots. And one of the things that I'm worried about is that there's great concern, and rightly so, about not stereotyping people from ethnic minorities and the racism that we saw in the riots that occurred. But it's also the case that in response to those riots, we equally have to be careful of not stereotyping people whose legitimate views are now being widely described as far right or racist or neo-Nazi, because they do not fit in with the narrative that is much more respectable. And a lot of the pupils will fall into that as well. So how do we avoid, or how do we make sure, going back to some of the things that Alice has said, that we are actually listening to all sides? And I suppose my final thought, just on to round it up, is on free speech, because there's a and what is critical thinking. It's one thing sort of technically teaching people, for example, what the difference is between the law on incitement and simply posting something on social media. But at the moment, what the arguments in the free speech land, which I'm sort of part of, which I, by the way, Tom, you said there are some people on the right who really believe, free speech absolutists. Think, no, I'm not on the right, but I'm definitely a free speech absolutist. But anyway, one of the things,
I wasn't describing you. I was just saying.
No, I know, but I'm saying in general. I'm just saying on the labelling. The thing that I think is that there is a lot of discussion at the moment about whether, in fact, people who are actually being sent to prison for things which they've posted online, whether they really are incitement, whether they actually reach that category, because they've all agreed to a guilty plea because they're frightened of how long they'll get sent down for. So I think there's a lot of contentious stuff here. And I thought it was great when we started talking about Scottish nationalism. Of course, I disagree because I'm not a supporter of Scottish nationalism, but it indicated to me exactly why politics is such a rich, varied, important scene of where we argue and have different views on things. And the big concern is that we don't end up teaching a very rigid view of what is the truth, what is correct, and we stop people exploring the different ways of looking at the world and the different political outlooks you might have.
Look, Claire, thanks. Feel free to stick around, Claire. You may have to go, but feel free to stick around. I'm going to bring Dan in next. Dan, good evening to you.
Good evening, Tom. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for coming. Dan is the director of Stand for All. Dan, can you share your thoughts on, because I saw that you posted and you were quite supportive of Bridget Phillipson's pronouncement around this tackling of fake news. Can you tell us a little bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we absolutely need to be giving children, young people, the ability to identify what is misinformation and fake news. And this is a big difference about free speech. There's one thing about saying we have differing opinions, different political sides, and another thing about spreading actual misinformation. Now, we've seen, obviously, current news, we're seeing the riots at the moment, and we've seen children as young as 12 being involved in these and listening to what's been spread. And we saw misinformation used at the start of this. But it's a wider scale thing, and it goes across all political divides of information that is just factually incorrect. And we see it with adults sharing it as well. We plays to perception bias. Times have moved on, and we need to make sure that we are giving young people the tools to really look at them in the context of what they are seeing, whether that is social media or anything else. I mean, it'd be great if they could be looking at it in terms of wider news as well. But it's not about free speech. It's not about political opinion. It's about what is actually false and being able to identify that.
Do you think there's an issue with identifying what is fake news and what is sort of hate speech and these different things and conspiracy theories? Do you think there's an issue there inherently in terms of that?
Sorry, you've broken up there.
Oh, sorry. I'll just repeat that again. Do you think there's... Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yeah. Do you think there's an issue with classifying what is fake news and what is a conspiracy theory and what is hate speech?
I think there's a huge risk. There's an old line in policy that you never make a law that you don't want a government opposing you to have in the future. You can't say this is what we are going to say specifically is wrong, because then somebody else in the future could come along and say, well, actually, we are now using that law to say this is wrong. It's giving people the tools to be able to make educated and informed opinions on stuff, because people are bombarded, and it's not just young people, it's adults as well, are bombarded with information, and it plays to perception bias and
Do you think that's an
silly
issue, though?
things.
Do you think that's an issue? Because you were widely sort of supportive of what, this sort of plan for schools and teachers. Do you think that idea, though, that you've just expressed in terms of perception bias and bias within one's own thoughts, do you think that's an issue, though, for teachers in the classroom doing it, where they're then biased?
I think it needs to be very carefully done, and there is always a risk. I trained as a teacher 20 plus years ago now.
Yeah.
And there was always a risk then of your beliefs coming through in the way you teach. But I think most of us try and avoid that. And I think most young people will call us out on it as well. It's more about making sure they've got the tools and awareness, because a lot of young people are incredibly aware of the risks of social media, probably more so than adults. But there's so much, the way misinformation is spread is a lot more nuanced and complex now than I think a lot of people realise. It's not like we saw with the riots, a tweet, piece of wrong information went out very quickly and was spread deliberately by a lot of people. But a lot of this stuff is far more nuanced, and people need that ability to go, okay, we can see where that's not matching up with what else we know, and teaching those critical thinking skills, not as a specific course, but throughout the curriculum. So it's with Bridget Phillipson's talk about IT, talk about English, looking at it in different ways. And I think that's the way to go forward with it, yes.
Because I know I won't speak for Claire because she's here, but Claire raised a point earlier about she was saying that views, if you like she gave examples of I don't know, somebody being very, very pro Brexit, very anti mass migration. She gave the example of Israel being very anti-Israel, being very on one side of, and saying that she, in her opinion, she could see some of those issues being seen one way and not the other, whereas other issues being seen that way. I mean, really, you've answered that question already in what you said, but I guess that's what she was saying is that sort of idea that there'll be a lot of bias within there.
There's always going to be an inherent bias, and the curriculum needs to be very careful on how it does it, of how we give these tools. But we give tools to young people for all sorts of different ways, which could be influenced in different ways. Now, I respect Claire entirely, but unlike her, I'm not a free speech absolutist. I do believe there are times when nobody should be able. The argument I go is, if someone says, I am anti-immigration, that is their opinion, and whether I agree or disagree with it, it should be respected. If someone says, let's burn that mosque, that's a totally different area.
Yeah.
And I think there has to be levels on it. But what I think we need to look at is giving people the tools to make their own choices, but look at things more critically and not just go, okay, I've seen this on the internet, therefore it must be real, which we see actually, I think, probably more nowadays from adults than we do from young people, but it's good to have that coming through.
Well, I think Claire also mentioned that. She said teenagers are probably more savvy in some ways than adults towards a lot of sort of AI-generated content, which is true. They
exactly,
are.
Yeah.
But I think on the flip side to that, I think also young people can be quite trigger happy when it comes to sharing of information, perhaps. I mean, adults can be as well. So actually, I don't necessarily think that they're any better or worse. But I certainly think you think of something like TikTok. It's incredibly easy to share stuff on, isn't it? And that's the issue. It's just so easy to share stuff on. Kirsty, I don't know whether I'll come back to you, Dan, just in a second. Kirsty, have you got any views on anything Dan said up to this point?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's almost a bit like a danger with when Bridget Phillipson said about revamping the curriculum and arming schools with a new curriculum with, that's based on addressing fake news and conspiracies, because I think quite a few people have said it already that teenagers are a lot more well informed than we realise. I think during the time of the riots, I was on quite a few apps, and I was noticing on TikTok that quite a lot of teenagers were making videos, even if they were formed with humour and satire. A lot of them were speaking a lot of sense, and I don't really want to be in a situation where we're told to teach this, and this in this way, when some of our teenagers could come to the classroom with some really interesting discussions. I think it would really benefit from appreciating what young people already know, inviting them to the conversation, rather than using like a top-down approach from the government. And I think that's what's making us feel a little bit quite vulnerable, a little bit fearful for what's to come next, because it could be anything that they're making us do, essentially. And I think that's where the anxiety comes from as teachers.
Dan, do you want to come back on that?
I would entirely agree. I don't think it should be down to the government to say this is what is right, this is what is wrong. I think however this is done, it has to be very focused on here are the tools so that you can analyse what you're seeing yourself, put it in the framework of what you know, what you can actually say, I've double checked this.
Yeah.
It's about giving young people, as I said before, I think we really need to do with adults as well, but giving them the opportunity and the tools and the knowledge to be able to question stuff themselves, rather than the government saying, this is what is fact, this is what is wrong. Because that's a very dangerous line, because you don't know what a future government is going to decide on that. So,
Paul,
sorry, Tom, just to add as well.
Kirsty,
it's just reminded me a little bit, to be honest, because obviously as an English teacher, we're told to choose novels that are from the canon, and I know that's been an ongoing conversation about what is the canon, what is the best books to be made, and I know the likes of Jennifer Webb is doing some brilliant work on that, and it's kind of the same idea, isn't it, of what is truth, what is bad, what is etc. Because then we're looking into the areas of students' identities, in terms of what their family think, their heritage, and as a teacher and myself, I don't speak any of the languages, and I would hate to stand in front of a classroom full of students from different cultures and go, this is what the truth is because this is Britain, and I just feel so uncomfortable with that.
Yeah.
So.
Can I just say, I fully agree with that. That's something we've got to be very careful of, is saying this is the absolute, when actually it's far more nuanced.
Do you think, though, there's also the split again, to play devil's advocate? Do you think there were also those who would say we're too, almost the opposite of that, we're too scared to say what Britishness is? There'll be those who would argue. There were those who would argue that we don't want to talk about British values. We don't want to talk about Britishness because we find it awkward or something. And I'm talking about schools and classrooms now. That playing devil's advocate there.
It's just so abstract, isn't it? It's what is Britishness? It changes every day for some people, doesn't it?
This thing, I mean, my job is obviously monitoring what's in the news, what people are saying, and responding to it. And as Chris said, it changes every day for what are British values, but we never seem to stop talking about it. It's always there coming through. And I think there is no, this is what British values mean. So it's always very dangerous to tell people this is what you should believe one way or the other on that one. Where I support the proposals.
They've said what they are, haven't they? I mean, whether we agree with them or not, there is a set of British values, which are democracy, individual liberty, mutual respect, tolerance, and the rule of law. I mean, that's what they're down on paper as.
Even those are incredibly nuanced. You look at the US at the moment with the way Donald Trump's talking about democracy and still promoting it as democracy while saying you'll never have to vote again. I think this is why we need those critical thinking tools so people can actually go, is this actually what that word means?
But could I interrupt?
Yeah, go, Claire.
This is partly why what my concern is. I mean, I want young people, of course, to have as full and richer discussion about democracy as possible, to understand, not just those who do A-level politics. It would be part of socializing young people is to introduce them to some of these concepts. As it happens, I think a cornerstone of democracy is free speech, but that's an argument. But nonetheless, to introduce them to these big ideas, that's fine. But I don't feel as though that's exactly what's being demanded post riots at the moment by Bridget Phillips. And I suppose that's the argument that we're having, because the points that you just made is there's no outside of the classroom agreement on the benefits of Western democracy. You say that you support Western civilization and people kind of look at you like you're completely mad. This used to be the cornerstone of what we were trying to pass on, of the best that's known and thought. And I know even that is contentious. So the questions and the subtleties and the nuances of these issues are certainly something that I'm not frightened of young people being introduced to. But that's why when they say, you've got to clamp down on, it's almost like this sort of, that's why I was saying wage war on putrid fake news is so dangerous, because to me, it actually winds up the wrong subject. It actually creates almost a narrative of us and them. It assumes that we all agree on everything when in fact we don't agree on these things. And so isn't the answer in schools to give people the best intellectually way in to understanding what democracy is? I mean, I'd be all for them having history lessons to understand the history of democracy coming out of ancient Greece, what the Enlightenment was, all of the things that are associated with the emergence of democracy. But that's not what anyone means, is it? And so that's why I'm concerned that this can become a political football with teachers given an impossible task of stamping down on things in a rigid way that will actually create more tensions in the classroom rather than opening up young people's minds to the possibilities of, or to understand that there's a whole history of arguments about these issues that needs to be gone through. I'd want them to read lots of books on it, but I don't want a kind of blueprint of this is the truth. You will understand that this is a lie. Watch out. One thing, check your sources. That's fine. But very different to what I think is being advocated.
Paul, you haven't had a chance to come in on this. I'll go Paul, then Dan, and then anyone else. So Paul, any thoughts?
Yeah, I'm just loving the fact that everyone understands how difficult a minefield this is and the nuances required. In fact, when you listed the 4 principles there, or the 4 British values, I'd never heard that before, because I teach in a different country and we don't have that. And yet it's even the arrogance of saying these are the British values, but it only, I think, applies to England and Wales. Excuse my ignorance. And actually, when you look at the 4 values and reflect on maybe the last 6 or 7 years of parliamentary behaviour, you start laughing a wee bit at it and thinking, well, if it doesn't come from the top, it's not going to. I think that's been a big issue in British society the last couple of years. I think a lot of people who are working class, etc., look up and think, well, you don't obey the law. You take what you want. You do a runner. You have billions of pounds, abroad in the Cayman Islands, and yet you demand I pay my tax, and you hit people who maybe dodged £2 of benefits and put them in jail. It's just nuts when you look at it, and it's a hypocrisy which I think would make this whole thing fail. Yet when I listen to my fellow professionals, I listen to people here who are aware of the difficulties of this and would be quite prepared to present some of the skills and cases and difficult cases, and then stand back and let the young people explore it and come to their own conclusions within reason. And I actually don't believe freedom of speech is curtailed in Britain. I think what people don't understand is, yeah, you can say what you want, but for some things you say, there could well be consequences, So yeah, go ahead and say it, go ahead and do it, go ahead and riot, but there might be a kickback at the end of it all. Thank you.
Dan?
Well, first of all, I entirely agree with Paul. The freedom of speech isn't freedom from consequence. But I would say that with this specific debate about giving young people the tools to analyse information, 2 phrases that really annoy me are post-truth and fake news, because once upon a time we just used to call them lies. And we need to be very careful of, are we saying, look, we want to show people that there are things being put out there which are false, but look legitimate. These aren't people's personal opinions or anything else. They are flat out lies, but they are made to look legitimate. And it can get very complicated at times, even for myself, of identifying which are which. And that's why I think it really is important that this is starting to be a thing that we look at, analysing. We can see that isn't right. That is not an opinion. I'm not about people's opinions and differing political stances. I'm talking about actual misinformation that is being spread as if it's fact. And that's where it's really important that people have the tools to combat it.
This is an interesting point, this whole idea of post-truth. You know, I think what you said there hits on a good point of there is still truth. Truth still exists. Facts still exist. If someone says, I want to hurt you, and they say it, that's a fact. That can't be denied, unless, of course, the voice has been AI generated. But you take my point. There are certain things that just have happened, and there is truth out there. I do believe it's much harder to find that truth now, and to identify that truth, and to maybe even understand that truth. But the truth still exists. It's just that there is such a bombardment of different views now that it's quite hard to find the truth in there as an adult, never mind a child. Anyway, Alistair,
Tom, I'll come in at that point. My reception isn't great here, Tom, so I'm struggling to hear others' contributions. So forgive me if I'm not reflecting properly what people have said, but I think I've got the gist of it. I probably bring an interesting perspective in that for the last 15 years, I've taught A-level critical thinking as a standalone subject. And I know that that's a controversial subject to make in many contexts. Now, let me just say this, first of all, I absolutely believe that I should be delivering critical thinking in the domain of geography, which is my main subject that I teach. But whenever people tell me that you can't teach it separately, I look at my experience of 15 years and I have to try and reconcile that. Either I'm deluding myself that I've wasted all of that time, or my understanding of what it means to teach it maybe is a little bit different. So in terms of teaching it, and what makes that different from teaching it in geography, is that I do teach an element of what you might call domain knowledge about critical thinking. So how do we analyze the elements of an argument, even recognizing something like that? What is an argument? It's not necessarily hurling abuse at each other. It's a reason that leads to conclusion. It must be some kind of reasoning and evidence-based. How do we evaluate that? We're looking at things like I've heard mention of cognitive biases, logical fallacies. These things can be identified and taught explicitly and exemplified for the students. And what I find when I teach critical thinking is that I have the freedom to do that in a way that I find that I just don't when I'm teaching geography because of the busyness and how full the specification is. It also promotes a set of dispositions. It's about how we approach these things, that this isn't necessarily about, getting a set of facts that we're all going to agree on here. It's about listening to each other. It's about understanding. It's about having humility. It's about having the ability to say, well, perhaps in light of new evidence, my position on this should evolve. And that if I discover that my position should evolve in light of evidence, I've discovered something good and worthwhile. And then the pedagogical approach, as I say, I just have the time really to explore these things. And I do that largely through a questioning basis. So if somebody made the statement, I don't believe in immigration, there's loads of opportunities that you can do by asking questions to get them to reflect and explore without me having to say, no, you're absolutely wrong. This is my view. This is my opinion. That's not my job. My job is to get them to reflect and explore, which brings me to the point you were just making about truth. Because one of the things that we cover in critical thinking is that we define truth in different ways depending depending on the context. So in the domain of science, scientific truth is very different from what you would call historical truth, which is very different from how you would define truth within English, and so on and so forth. So we actually have this opportunity, I suppose, through teaching this subject to have that helicopter view of what you might call the disciplinary knowledge rather than substantive knowledge. How do we approach defining truth within these different contexts? So if you're looking at, say, for example, I posed the question, can an asylum seeker be illegal? Well, that's a question that relates to law. So there is actually an objective reality to the answer to that question. That's not a matter of opinion. But to ask the question, how many immigrants should we allow into the UK, is a very, very different question. And the nature of how we're defining truth and exploring opinions in that changes and varies. And just making our young people aware of that. So whenever you're interacting with this information, when something comes at you in social media, to sit down and reflect, what category of information is this? What type of domain am I in? How is truth explored and developed within that domain? And in that context, how valid is this opinion being expressed? And it's really about promoting, and I absolutely concur with everybody that says, those of us who have the privilege of being in the classroom are blown away day after day by how amazing our young people are. And if we just give them these opportunities and equip them. So for me, this isn't about saying, I, as a teacher, am in the position of I know all the truth, all my opinions are correct. Nonsense. But I absolutely can equip them to think deeper, more richly, better. I can absolutely develop the dispositions that get them to reflect rather than react. And in all of that context, I can come in and ask questions, get them to think. And as I said earlier, if somebody thinks in the light of evidence and reflects and changes their view, that's not a threat to their identity. That's actually them growing and evolving as a human being.
I think Dan's got to go. Dan, thanks so much for joining us this week. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Sorry to have to head off, but it's been a fascinating discussion. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
Okay, wishing it.
As Dan heads off, I'm just going to mention our sponsors tonight again, which is John Catt Educational. If you're a teacher and you are interested in advancing your professional development, then check out the John Catt range of books and opportunities at the John Catt Bookshop. That's johncattbookshop.com. You can get 20% off any John Catt book by using the code JCTTR2425, and you can get 20% off. That's JCTTR2425 for 20% off any book order on the John Catt website, johncattbookshop.com. I'm going to go to Kirsty again. Now, Kirsty, I wanted to ask you, from a teaching perspective, obviously as a history teacher myself, alongside you as a head of English, let's imagine they turn around to you in September and said, right, we've got this new curriculum review, and they've decided that we need to incorporate some lessons on, or some content on identifying fake news and conspiracy theories online and hate speech online and so on. Can you give me an example, if it was you and this was September now, as a head of English, and you had to tell your teachers, right, this is what we're going to do? Can you give me a practical example of how you would go about that? And can you give me a lesson or a piece of content or something you would do?
I mean, I think the first thing that I would be asking whoever would be telling me to do that would be, okay, give me the exact sources that you want me to use. Maybe not the exact sources, but perhaps the exact, news outlets, if they wanted me to use recent news events. If it wasn't that, I would kind of use previous lessons that I've done before and sort of go to the most ridiculous examples of advertising. So, for example, there's loads of horrific adverts out there that advertise, brilliant pieces of bakery or like a Big Mac. And you put that on the screen and we look at the pictures and go, right, would you buy this? And then students are obviously going, oh, no, it looks horrible. And then we'd say, well, why? What is it about the advertisement that's putting you off? Because it's selling something, it's truth. And then they start to pick it apart visually. I would probably start there, and then we'd build up to the textual element of advertising, and then look at actual fake news. But yeah, I would have to be very, very sensitive around that in saying, right, well, what exactly do you want me to use? Because you never know, I could give a student an article to analyse, and then they might go home to their parents and go, guess what, my English teacher said that this is all wrong, but you said this, and very, very difficult. So I'd need the autonomy to know what sources I can use. But
I
other than
think
that, I
like
would definitely go
even
from the extreme advertising. Sorry.
even like I'm agreeing with you, and even the term fake news is problematic in
Yeah.
its
Oh,
in
we do
itself,
absolutely.
isn't it?
We'll look at the. I'd look at the word. I'd look at the language. What does fake mean? And really,
Yeah,
really break that down.
because really that's from like Trump did that. He made fake news as a thing, didn't he? I guess
Yeah.
like he
How
came up
ironic.
with that. Yeah, and like no one's really. He's so problematic because exactly what you just said. Like, what is it? Like, what is fake news? Because to some people, fake news would be something they strongly disagree with. Okay,
Yeah.
that's fake news because really Trump's done that himself. But I can think of people on the left who've done that. You know, on the right, on the left, whatever. That's fake news because I don't like it, right?
Yeah.
And for many teachers, if they're not aware of that, like your answer, like from me as the interviewer, I'm nodding my head. I'm going, yeah, that's good. But there'll be many others who will jump straight into this and go, oh, I know what's fake news. Anything written in the Daily Mail, anything written in the Guardian. Let's be honest, the profession is very, very left leaning, so it will be more likely that it will be more likely people say anything written in the Daily Mail is fake news, right? And that is a bit of a worry from this. Is I think you raised this right at the beginning, Kirsty, in terms of, you know, that and Alistair's actually said it himself in terms of trying to take a step back a little bit and be the disseminator and the facilitator, and yes, go through processes to help students to navigate the online world. Absolutely do that. But when it comes to here's some examples of fake news, here's some examples of hate speech, here's some examples of this, here's some examples of that. Now you might be able to pick something that everybody can agree on, but you know, it's muddy waters,
it's
isn't it?
funny because quite a lot of the time, you know, as you know, for a history teacher, we'd go straight for the propaganda posters sometimes and go, right, you know, it says, you know, we want your country to come to war. We go, well, this was a lie 'cause it's propaganda. But at the time, that was making soldiers go to war. So at the time, there was a truth in that until they realised the extent of the propaganda. So even that can open up interesting conversations as well.
Well, this is it with propaganda. It's like some things can exaggerate a truth.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like some things
exactly.
can exaggerate a truth. Like it doesn't have to necessarily be fake news. It can be much more nuanced than that, in that they're taking something with a smidgen of truth and they're exaggerating it massively and making it this. Yeah. Is that fake news? Well, technically not, because there's a smidgen of truth in there somewhere.
Exactly.
But is it bad? Yes. Because is it propaganda? Yes. Is it fake news? No. This is all part of like this as a teacher having to navigate that. Yeah. Surely most teachers out there, and by the way, thanks everyone for listening along. Hope you find this conversation interesting. I certainly am. But as a teacher, it's a bit of a minefield, isn't it? Paul, any thoughts? Or Alistair, either one of you.
Yeah, Tom, I'm just going to ask you a question.
Go on. No, I don't like these ones.
Always the teacher, even in the summer holidays. So which do you see more as your role? To tell the young people what fake news is, or to help them to explore identifying fake news for themselves?
I would never, I don't think I would ever tell students what something that was fake news. Because
so if you felt that it was fake news, but you didn't want to tell them that, how would you then approach teaching that?
I would go back to what I said. So this is just me personally. I would go back to what I said earlier in terms of, okay, let's look at a process that we would go through to analyze this piece of information. Step 1, we look at the source. Step 2, we qualify that against 10 other sources to check that it's true or not. Step 3, who is producing the source? Are they coming at it from a particular angle? Step 4, what language are they using in the source? Are they using language that sort of is persuasive, or is it factual, or is it, you know, blah, 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 blah. That's the way I'd approach it. But I worry that a lot of other teachers would not approach it that way. In me saying I would never do that, I think there's a lot of teachers who would say, yes, I would do that quite happily.
Yeah, and I think that's where these conversations are so important because, the lessons that we've learned in Northern Ireland are the lessons that say that it's what you've just outlined, it's the how we approach things rather than the what we say. So, Kirsty, I was going to ask you a question off the back of that.
Yeah.
As an English teacher, how similar or different would Tom's approach be to what you've outlined of the likes of multimodal analysis when you look at newspaper headlines with images and so forth?
Yeah.
Would you say that what Tom has outlined is broadly similar or very different from what you would do in English?
No, I think that definitely tackling it with questioning it and looking at the purpose and we always look at the text type, whether it's an article, autobiography, whatever it is. Then we look at the intended audience or implied audience, and then we'd look at the purpose of it and pick that apart. And then we'd go even deeper and look at the exact words used, the language used, and then we'd even go deeper than that and look at the grammatical construction. And that's where it gets very interesting in English, because a simple comma can make the whole difference to the purpose of that paragraph or sentence. So we do get some fascinating discussions around that, but it always links back to writer's intention and the purpose of that piece of work that they've wanted to publish.
Yeah,
Just
you see, that's brilliant. So imagine that a year 10 pupil sits in your class, experiences that, leaves at the end of that period and goes to your class, Tom, and experiences what they've experienced. Has that young person had a good experience on how to develop their own skills in critical thinking?
Well, Alistair, is your question leading and therefore conspiracy theorying? Because it feels like all of your questions are very leading. they're
very
very much
nervous.
leading us to give you the information that you want to hear. So I'm going to flip it back onto you, Alistair, and say that your questioning is not impartial enough.
Guilty as
Claire,
charged.
before I bring Mike in, do you want to come in on anything that's been said?
God, there's so much that's so interesting. But one of the things that I keep thinking was this would be a brilliant lesson. I don't know whether this is the kind of lesson with so many, things being argued over that is intended. That was where I started. I'm all for these kind of open discussions in schools, but I'm just not convinced that's exactly what's being demanded of you as teachers. One thing I thought when you were talking about fake news and so on, I remember, well, just to say at the moment, people are having posts removed. Richard Dawkins has had his whole Facebook closed down. People are having posts removed from LinkedIn as dis and misinformation. And the contentious issue there is over without getting into it, the question of gender and sex and the Olympics and boxing. Yeah. But they've had
let's not go there, but carry on.
No, what I'm saying is exactly, let's go there. Say a pupil raises it. What do we say? Don't let's go there.
Oh no, not at all in the classroom, but just on my podcast. Let's not go there. In the classroom.
I'm not trying to drag you into it. I'm trying to say there's a lot of things that are labeled. People are very certain sometimes, and these are big social media companies, at labeling things as fake news or disinformation or misinformation, when actually they aren't quite. And I was in the House of Lords with somebody who did a lot of work, a lot of good academic work on the origins of the COVID vaccine, and said it was likely to have come from a lab in Wuhan in China, and was immediately kind of shouted down as a conspiracist. He was a xenophobic because he was being anti-Chinese, and that this was disinformation, misinformation. Lots of social media posts were removed who argued that. And of course, now as the things have settled, it's become clear that that's the most likely explanation for COVID. And now, without apology, I agreed with you.
Claire, when Alistair asked me, would you ever tell them that something is fake news? I wouldn't. Now that actually would maybe apply in these situations you're giving as well, because the phrase fake news in itself is problematic. Could I say, for example, instead something a bit more nuanced, like I'm doubtful about this, or something, let's question this, or let's explore this, or something, instead of this is fake news.
Yeah, but I agree, it's difficult. I'm not saying I've got an easy answer. I think I went in and I wrote this in, my book on free speech, but I went into a sixth form and I was a bit taken aback when quite a lot of the sixth formers told me as fact and that I was being conned and being hoodwinked. They told me that the 9/11 towers, catastrophe and that terrorist thing was actually a Jewish conspiracy. And, and I said, guess what? That's fake news. I didn't say that's an interesting perspective. Let's have a chat. So I'm not saying it's easy all the time, right? It can be difficult. Therefore, what I'm nervous about is when an education secretary of state tells teachers that what you are responsible for is sorting this out in the classroom, that it's a poison chalice for you. That's where I started, right? And I would prefer that the brilliant thing that teachers do is introduce real critical thinking via subjects. And by the way, I'm not opposed to critical thinking at A level. I'm not even making that point. That's fine. Carry on, teach it. It's a subject within its own terms. But just to kind of say we're going to introduce this so that they can identify fake news and that we won't have any more riots, because this is why the riots happened, misunderstands the nature of the riots on the one hand, and also misunderstands the complexity of what we label post-truth, fake news, misinformation, disinformation, which actually legislators can't agree on. And therefore, I think that teachers will be hard-pressed to pick up that mantle and therefore get blamed if it goes wrong. That's the other thing that will happen.
I think, can I just add as a bit of a caveat to that as well, is that I think with Bridget Phillipson coming out and saying, we need to wage this war, as she said, I think as a classroom teacher, not even as a head of English, my first priority would be a bit more pastoral. There's been the summer holidays when this has happened, and I think a lot of our students are going to be feeling very uncomfortable, either through peer pressure, having to follow others in their opinion, or others that are from different cultures, they're scared how they're going to be treated. And I think I'd want to make sure that my classroom was a safe space, and the school is, before going, right, this is fake news. So I think she's kind of looking at the wrong thing because of this emotional issue that we've got at the minute. That's just a bit of a caveat, really, but it'd be nice to focus on the emotional safe space rather than let's change the curriculum now.
No,
that's absolutely huge, Kirsty. It's the psychological safety.
Absolutely.
I think, you're absolutely right to bring that. The only thing that I would say, it's not just a little caveat. I actually think it's even more important than that. It's the foundation, and that's why the privilege that we have as teachers, because we are there week after week with our students, we develop the relationship, we bring that pastoral dimension, and we're engaging with our young people in that context as we deal with these things in the long term. It's absolutely vital. So I'm glad you made that point.
Thank you.
Mike, do you want to come in next?
Yeah, just a couple of points. I'm not a teacher, but I did. My hobby was working with a youth organisation for 28 years.
Yeah.
One of the most mentally rewarding things I've ever done in my life. You're talking about youngsters that they are more intelligent than people give them credit for sometimes. I'll give you two examples. One, we was on a battlefield tour of the beach, and while we were walking through a field, in fact, the guide found a piece of shrapnel with one of the brass bands on from a shell, and he asked for it, and he was asking the guide how he could preserve it and everything. And we turned into Tynecott Cemetery, and as soon as he's in the cemetery, he threw a piece of shell away, and the guide asked him, "Why have you done that?" He says, "Because parts of this shell could probably have killed people in this cemetery, so I don't want to know it." So he thought through that. Another thing with we did a thing called Outreach, where we took a group of 60 youngsters that were close to being permanently excluded from school, and we took them on a couple of weekends, adventure training weekends, camping weekend, and when we met with the teachers because we had to know about all these children. And to be honest, the way the teachers described these people, these kids, we thought we were going to have a throat slit in the middle of the night because there was so much bias towards against these young kids. And they came and we worked with them, and we found they were just kids that needed a little bit more, a bit more, in depth with them, I suppose. I mean, one of the girls, a teacher said, she always makes this one particular teacher cry, and I said, why do you do that? And she says, because I can. And it was, well, do you think that's something you should be doing? In the end, anyway, they did. We must have made a good impression because out of the 60 kids that we took away for the 2 weekends, 45 of them went to one of our locations and wanted to join up.
Oh, that's great, Mike. Listen, Mike, thanks so much for calling in and sharing your thoughts. Really, really appreciate it. Thanks very much. God, we've had lots of callers today. We've got Annabelle coming in next. Apologies to Adam and Belfast. I don't think we're going to have time for you now as we're sort of on the way towards wrapping up. But Annabelle, do you want to share your thoughts on all of this?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, hear you loud and clear.
It's been so helpful, actually. I'm really glad that I listened in tonight because it's just really pertinent. I've just been really thinking about how I can introduce this at school. I'm looking at the moment at personal development and what we deliver in tutor time. So I've been thinking really carefully about, are our tutors going to be able to have these conversations, and thinking about the critical thinking as well. So I'm coming into this from a couple of angles. So I'm an English teacher and I've been a head of English before. When I was a head of English, it was just interesting hearing Kirsty talking, because when I was a head of English, we knew that we needed students to sort of be able to form opinions and be prepared to try and listen and understand other people's viewpoints. So we brought in then, this is just an example of this practical ideas, a weekly academic reading lesson for Key Stage 4, which involved them reading an article. And again, like you said, we had to make sure that we were really choosing carefully the articles, so that we were not, favouring a particular newspaper, for example, but they read an article and then they sort of summarised the ideas. We looked at particular pieces of language and we looked at particular viewpoints and things in it. And we found that really helpful. So in terms of, can you teach critical thinking? I think that question's a little bit like, can you teach comprehension skills? Because we know that they're largely knowledge-based. Same, I think it is for critical thinking, but it doesn't mean to say you can't practice those skills. I think you can in isolation, actually. And one of the most useful ways, I think, is to give examples of maybe 2 different articles about the same topic, rather than just one, so that using that point of comparison, students can see where language is perhaps more inflammatory in one than in the other, and why that might be based on whoever it is that's actually written it. So that's something that I've done sort of really effectively in English, but now I'm trying to think like how now I can sort of also do that more whole school, and wondering whether with tutors is potentially the right time to do it. I know Kirsty mentioned about the sort of pastoral, just that they've got time to actually empathise and understand with ideas in a sort of slightly less pressured environment than the classroom. So that's where I am with my thinking.
But what do you think specifically about all the fake news stuff in terms of that side of it? Like how would you approach that? Because that to me is more tricky than the critical skills and sort of thinking side.
Yeah, well, that side of it, I think what Claire was saying, she's right. We absolutely don't want to be dragged into those political situations. I think a lot of students, not all, are much more capable at spotting fake news than we actually potentially are as adults. And I think I've delivered those fake news lessons before, and they just find it really patronising, I think. So I think it's by developing that critical thinking that we actually get them to be better at understanding the fake news. But I think we have got to be more what's the word? We've got to be a bit more intentional about it now, rather than just making sure we cover what fake news is as part of our curriculum. I think that language of like waging war and putrid is not necessarily particularly helpful. But I think we've got to find a better way of doing it than we are at the moment, because what we're doing at the moment is actually probably doing our young people a bit of a disservice, really.
I think if you surveyed most teachers, I think most teachers would agree there needs to be a larger focus on this from a wider perspective. I think it's a growing issue in terms of the consumption of information online, and that I think most teachers would agree we need to have a greater focus on it.
Yeah.
But the bit where there's still quite a bit of debate, I think, to be had is what sort of focus that is. I mean, what you've just suggested there sounds, personal view here, sounds pretty good to me. But again, there's just going to be so many different approaches to this from across the board. And I guess this is the thing, right? Is it's where it goes wrong. And that's your big thing. It's like when it's going right, it's great. When it's going wrong, you've really got a problem there.
There's a lot of staff training needed, isn't there? That we cannot assume in any way that teachers are going to feel skilled enough to have these conversations, and we certainly don't want them to get dragged into political situations. We know that is not what is going to be helpful.
I guess like it's one of those where you might say, well, keep the politics out of it, but everything's sort of political in a way, isn't it? So it's sort of, there has to be, you've got to approach these issues. It's just how they're tackled. Right, we are out of time, everyone. I just want to give a massive thanks to everybody for joining in the conversation, for listening in as well. Everybody tweeting in, all the different voices we've had. It's been really, really fascinating. Some excellent things, and certainly for me, like as host, I've learned a lot tonight in terms of just about critical thinking, critical skills. I know we've talked about how to look at information, how children are looking at information online. So it's been really educational, really good conversation. So thanks everybody, and just a final shout out to our brilliant sponsors. Massive thanks to John Catt for supporting us at Teachers Talk Radio and on the show this evening. Great supporters of the teaching profession in general. And if you want to find out more about them, visit the John Catt Bookshop at johncattbookshop.com. I'll be back next Monday evening at 7:30 p.m. And until then, have a wonderful week, everybody, and speak to you soon.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.